you for joining us for our presentation of the Tennessee Investment and Student Achievement Package, which is our new student-centered and student-focused funding formula for public schools in Tennessee. It's a big day for our state, certainly an important day for public education in Tennessee. It is a big day because there have been a lot of Tennesseans that have engaged in this and worked together to create a funding formula that works for families and works for teachers and works for Tennessee going forward. Our goal has been to take what is a cumbersome and outdated BEP formula and create a model that supports in a transparent way that supports students in our state. We need to invest more in our public schools in our state, but we don't need to invest in a bulky, out-of-date funding formula. The BEP doesn't deserve $1 billion to be put in it, but our students do deserve a $1 billion increase in public education funding. They do deserve funding that ensures that our third graders can read. And they do deserve funding that makes sure that they have a pathway that prepares them for life beyond the classroom. And they deserve funding that fits every student's individual needs and circumstances. And this formula is designed to do just that. Parents should take note that this formula is straightforward. It actually fits in a folder, just like this is not a bulky bureaucratic piece of legislation. This is a piece of legislation and a funding formula that Tennesseans can understand, that parents can understand, that teachers and districts can understand, and that was important to us. Commissioner Schwinn is going to walk through the details with you, but I just want to give a few high-level components of this to make sure that, well, there are some things that we need to make sure that we point out. When I spoke in my State of the State address, I said that a teacher raise should be a teacher raise, and that we shouldn't be able to have a bureaucratic end around to keep funding that was intended to be teacher raises to have that funding used another way. This formula does that. In this formula, a teacher raise is a teacher raise. We talked a lot previously in education about how teachers should have accountability for student performance, but we also believe, and this funding formula takes into a consideration that we believe districts should have accountability as well when it comes to how it is that those districts spend the taxpayer dollars on public education. We also believe that, and we know that district professionals and public school board members should be provided professional development, should be required to take that professional development so that if they're going to be given the responsibility for funding and accountability for funding, that they be given the professional development in order to participate in those funding decisions. It's very important to me that this process and the funding formula be transparent so that teachers understand it, that districts understand it, that parents understand it. So there's a great level of transparency as well as a great level of accountability put into this plan. The General Assembly has increased responsibility for accountability for districts' performance. Districts are also rewarded for performance if they have the right outcomes. So there's a great level of that accountability sewn into this formula. This also ought to be a time for districts to take a deep breath because it does actually streamline the cash flow process for districts so they can budget and understand how and when the money is coming to their districts. These are just a few of the things that are important changes going forward. Here's the most important change. We are funding public education based on the individual needs of the students that access that funding education, that public education. We are making sure that parents understand that their child is receiving the funding for their public education based on their child's unique needs, whether that's concentrated poverty, a disability, a rural school. Individual needs will have individual funding decisions around it. And that's what's most important about this student-centered funding. Commissioner, why don't you walk through the
Yes, sir.
Slideshow, and then we'll take questions.
All right, thank you. So I appreciate everyone being here and want to start really about 3 decades of funding reform. So what we know is that since 2004, we've had BEP Review Committee recommendations. Those recommendations have looked very consistent year over year for almost 20 years now. We had a task force in 2014 that had recommendations that also looked very similar. And over the last 3 to 4 months, we've had over 200 Tennesseans actively engaged in subcommittees. We've had over 16 town halls. We've had social media town halls. We've also had thousands of comments and engaged parents, families, community members, teachers, superintendents, and others who've been able to contribute to what they want to be true for public education in the state of Tennessee. These are folks from around the state, so everyone from rural, suburban, and urban communities were able to use their voice. And I think what is so important about this process is that it was inclusive. Anyone who wanted to provide feedback or contribute was able to do so. And that did happen over 18 subcommittees and 6 meetings of each of those. Incredible participation, thinking about what made sense for their individual and unique lenses, and certainly and ultimately was based on what is best for students here in Tennessee. In terms of next steps, there's still a process. We're at a point in time. And so over the next several weeks, the bill's introduced. It is heard in at least 7 committees, so thoroughly vetted through the General Assembly. If it continues to move, it would be voted on by the Senate and the House. If it continues to move, signed by the governor before becoming law. So there is still a long way to go and a lot of conversation and discussion to come. But what we know we need to focus on in our state when we think about the needs of students are 3 things. So 1, a real focus on early literacy, making sure and empowering each student to read proficiently by 3rd grade. A lot of work has happened in Tennessee, especially looking back to the special session last year, really pushing aggressively on what is possible for reading in 3rd grade and the importance of that 3rd grade literacy benchmark. The second is preparing each high school graduate to succeed in the post-secondary program or career of their choice. We want to ensure that all of our high school students are empowered to thrive when they graduate. And we also want to ensure that every child is given the resources necessary to thrive, regardless of where they live in the state. So how is this formula designed to do that? So first and foremost, it's a significant investment. $9 billion in total education funding for fiscal year 24. That includes both state and local. Federal funding is on top of that. That is based on an investment of $1 billion in recurring funding for K-12 public education, with one-time funds of $750 million proposed for fiscal year 23. The biggest takeaways here are twofold. First and foremost, districts receive more funding under the new proposal than they would under the BEP, assuming enrollment is stable. Second, local contribution, that is the total amount that all of our districts contribute to the formula, would not increase for 4 years. In fiscal year 27, 4 years from now, that increase in dollar amount is approximately the same that districts would see under the BEP. So no additional amount on top of what they would normally do. The big point here is if you put $1 billion into the BEP, 25% of districts would have to increase taxes. That is not true under the new formula. It is constructed to control for local costs to ensure that locals can still meet that maintenance of effort. They can still contribute to public school funding while the state is able to increase what we are funding for public education. Here's how a student-based formula works. At the base, that is the amount of funding that goes for any student no matter where they live. Right now, that's $6,860 under the new proposal. Weights is on top of that. That is a weight that is times or a multiplier of the base for specific student needs that might be necessary for that child to meet expectations for grade level proficiency. We have direct funding. Those are dollar amounts for specific programs that are needed, again, for support of our students. And then outcomes funding is there to incentivize additional outcomes and really promoting some of the core areas of focus for our state. Base funding, that's $6.6 billion allocated to the base. Everything that was funded under the BEP would continue to be funding at a per student level, but we've also increased funding for getting to the national counselor ratio, that 1 to 250. It gets us to that national standard for nurses. It increases funding for RTI squared and technology. It also ensures that there's school safety funding for every student and ensures coordinated school health can be in place in every district and funded in every district. When we look at the weights, there are 4 categories of weights. There's weighting for economically disadvantaged students, and that includes a concentration of poverty for those schools that have large percentages of economically disadvantaged students. There is a weight for sparsity and small. There's also a weight for unique learning needs. That ensures that we have additional funding for students with disabilities and gifted students, students with characteristics of dyslexia, and students who are English learners. And then there is also a weight for charter school facilities that is bringing money that is currently outside of the BEP and bringing it into the new formula. When you look at how that breaks down for the weights, a child who is economically disadvantaged has a 25% weight, meaning you take that 6860 and multiply it by 25%. It's about a third of the students in the state of Tennessee. When you look at students who are in concentrated poverty, that is about 2/3 of our students, and that's a 5% weight on top of the 25% weight. Look at students who are in a sparse community, meaning it's 25 students per square mile or less. That is a 5% weight. If the student is in a small district that is 1,000 or fewer students, that would be an additional 5%. That helps to address things like the cost of transportation and economies of scale. And then students with unique learning needs, again, those are students with disabilities, gifted students, students with characteristics of dyslexia and English learners. They have a range of what those weights can be from 15% all the way up to 150%. There are 10 different levels of unique learning needs, again, to ensure that we are supporting the cost of the service to the child and not an aggregate or average. As a parent, I would want to know this is the service my child should be receiving in order to meet expectations. Here's how much money is being allocated to my child to ensure my child can thrive. When we looked at direct funding, there are a few major buckets here, again, aligned to the goals that are outlined of what this formula is designed to accomplish. Specifically, we have $500 for every kindergarten, first, second, and third grade student. That is specifically directed for early literacy programming. There's been a big push in Tennessee around ensuring every child can read on grade level by third grade. This is funding to support that effort. There was also a bill passed in special session last year, student acceleration and learning loss. What that does is it requires those students at the lowest level of proficiency in third grade reading to have high dosage tutoring the following year. This now funds that. For CTE, this continues to fund and increase the number of dollars that would go to students who are in CTE programs, ensuring that we can provide additional funding for those students who are in high demand or high value pathways and programs of study. We are also continuing to fund the ACT and ACT retake. In terms of outcomes funding, again aligned to the big goals that the formula is designed to accomplish, there are 2 different buckets. The first is on literacy. It's ensuring that we provide additional funding for those students who are reading on grade level in third grade, with a multiplier for those students who are low income. When we look at high school, this provides additional funding for students who either grow and or meet the benchmark for ACT performance, or they earn a tier 2 or tier 3 industry credential. We need to start thinking more about all of the pathways our students are on and ensuring that we are incentivizing success in whatever pathway the student is choosing. That generates an outcomes bonus. If the child is low income, they get even more for that bonus. Let's look at actual students and what that would mean for them. So in the formula, you've got 2 elementary school students here. Student 1 on the left gets the base of $6,860. This student also has a unique learning need. Maybe she has characteristics of dyslexia. So she would get 20% times that base value of $6,860. This is a second grader, so she also generates $500 to support her literacy development. In total, this student generates $8,732 in the formula. Student on the right is in a different area. He generates that same $6,860 for the base, but he also is economically disadvantaged, so he has the 25% weight. He goes to a Title I school, so he has an additional 5% weight. This child is in a sparse and a small community, so he generates 5% each, and he has 2 unique learning needs. So in our formula, you can have 2 for special education and another one if you're an English learner and another one for characteristics of dyslexia, depending on the student's need. This student has 2 needs. 60% and 20% weights. This child also needed 4th grade tutoring, so this child would generate an additional $500. In total, this student generates $15,592 because this child has significant additional needs compared to his friend on the left. Now you might think about middle school, and this is an example of 2 students who generate about the same amount of funding, even though they have different needs. The student on the left gets the base, but also has a significant unique learning need at 70%. The student on the right is still getting the base at 6860, but he is in a sparse community at 5%, and he's in a CTE class in 8th grade. What is really strong about the formula is that CTE is based on the class that the student is in, and it is also based on high demand or high need fields. So we can start to ensure that our districts who are looking to create CTE programs all the way down into middle school to give students more time and access to be completers. This 8th grade student actually generates CTE funding because he's enrolled in a CTE class in 8th grade. So both of these students get approximately the same amount. They're just funded for different things. High school. So our high school students, completely different needs again. Student on the left has the base of 6860. This student is economically disadvantaged and goes to a Title I school. This student also has a moderate unique learning need, but this student's in a really high demand or high wage CTE program as a senior. So that class is generating $6,000 for materials and equipment, the cost of teachers, etc. And the student takes the ACT. This student generates $17,847 in the formula. Compared to her 11th grade friend to the right, student 6, this student generates 6860 in the base, sparse district at 5%. This student is in a course that only generates $4,000 per course. That is still higher than what we are currently funding, and $185 for a CTE program. Different students have different needs, and so the funding should match the individual needs of each student. This is the entire formula for a district. When we think about the 46 components of the BEP and the number of pages to explain exactly how things are calculated based on ratios and averages, this is on a half a sheet of paper. Every district will receive this information today in an email that will go out from the department, as well as a follow-up individual call, and it will break down their data in this way. You can see the base amount. You can see each of the weights multiplied by the number of students and how much money that funds. You can see the direct allocation for the district and how it totals up. This does not include the outcomes funding at the end of the year. It also does not include the high growth or fast growth districts. Those are all additional sources of funds that would come and be generated by the district in the new education funding model. When you think about fast growing, those are districts that have more than 2% growth in any year. That means that we are going to fund those students in real time because the costs are being incurred by districts in real time. If you have those districts that are growing by more than 2% every year for 3 consecutive years, it is likely that those districts have additional infrastructure costs, such as purchasing school buses or building new buildings. So there's additional funding now for fast growing districts to purchase some of those additional equipment and or infrastructure needs that they might have. And what we heard a lot from subcommittee members was about teachers, and the governor spoke about the commitment in the TISA to ensuring that when there are salary increases for educators, those go to educator salaries. And so in the new formula, if the General Assembly appropriates money specifically for educator salaries, it mandates that it goes to those folks who are in the classroom during that time period. But it also says we need to maintain that commitment for future teachers. So when there's now an increase in funding for teacher salaries, the state board will have to increase that minimum salary schedule. So the benefit is felt for teachers forevermore. One of the big commitments over time is in January 2019, the minimum salary for teachers in the state of Tennessee was $35,000. This summer, there was a commitment made to get that to $40,000 in that 4-year period. We are on track to be at $45,000 by 2026. Significant increase in that minimum salary schedule. We know that can happen if we commit those dollars to what their intended purpose was. This funding formula does that. When we look at the breakdown of some of the policy pieces of the bill, one of the most important components is local contribution and fiscal capacity. One of the ways that you can build a formula is controlling for state costs, or you control for local costs. Governor wanted to make sure that we did not see an increase in taxes for our local communities, so we started with controlling for local costs. What that allowed us to do is to say that state and local will split the base and the weights 70-30, but the state will cover the costs of direct funding, of fast growing, and of outcomes. This also allowed for a streamlined model, and that is the SIEBR model for fiscal capacity. But that will now be annually evaluated by the Comptroller of the Treasury and approved by the state board every year. So there is an annual review of that process. This also ensures that the state can provide those districts who are in at-risk or distressed communities with additional grants to meet any difference in maintenance of effort. And there are certain districts with very special circumstances that we will continue to provide additional funding for. The big piece here, though, is that the bill that the state gives to districts every year is lower under the TISA than it currently is under the BEP. That does not change the maintenance of effort or the total amount of dollars that districts are provided by their local communities. This is in essence intended to be additional funding the state is giving. It is not a replacement. And so by maintaining your maintenance of effort and still lowering that bill for districts, we can make sure that there are no additional taxes while still putting more funding into our local communities. Transparency and accountability. The governor talked about the importance of that. If we're going to have more money in the system, there's been a real strong conversation about ensuring that there's appropriate accountability in that space. And so for school boards, you have to have a budget and your academic goals at the same time. Set goals and make sure that your budget supports those academic goals that you set. When you're looking at districts and public charter schools, there's a role where the General Assembly, through an ad hoc Education Finance Committee, can ask any district or public charter school who has a D or an F academically and has fiscal management concerns to report to them. That includes state-run districts. So what that would do is the General Assembly would be able to review, have discussions with those local districts and those public charter schools. They can have a discussion, they can require a corrective action plan, or they can appoint an inspector general over those finances, just like they do for county governments. That is also consistent with what has happened in other states under federal law when a district requires additional fiscal oversight. $1 billion of new funding is a lot of money, and appropriate accountability on that is important. That also means that people need to know what's happening with those dollars. And so there's improved reporting, detailed reports on here's how much funding was generated at the school site. How was that money spent? That is now a federal law. The state law, if this passes, would also continue to strengthen that so that if money is going for students with disabilities, you can actually make sure it was spent that way. Parents will have a better idea of how their children are funded. I have 2 kids in public school. I would be able to see exactly what the state and local community is funding for my children. And every parent deserves to have that level of transparency. Also, we have a BEP review committee, but instead of a small representative community, what we learned from the subcommittees is that everybody wants to have a voice in something as important as public funding for public schools. And so every year, every district will now have the opportunity to participate in that review process. Each of those reviews, if districts choose to participate, will be provided to the General Assembly before the start of session. So they will have that information before they consider legislation related to education in the upcoming session. But again, a more inclusive process that represents everybody. We will produce that report each year. Again, that will go to the Governor and General Assembly for review. And then finally, as the Governor discussed, professional development is important. The thing that I hear over and over and over is that nobody understands the BEP. It is complicated. It is one of the most complicated systems in the entire country. Well reported on that. And everyone knows part of it. But 46 different components averaged up that changes year to year is not the most streamlined way to fund our students. We need to have transparency and clarity, and everyone should understand it. The Governor showed that the bill actually fits in a folder. The formula fits on one page. But we need to make sure that our school boards, our superintendents, our financial managers, those who are on the state board, the Department of Education, county commissioners, deeply understand how the funding is generated and what it should be used for. So the department will provide professional development to ensure that everyone has that baseline understanding. Ultimately, and at the end of the day, the importance of any new funding formula has got to be about kids. The shift in how we think about funding public education has got to move from what this means in the aggregate and averages and ratios and really focus on every single student. The way I think about it is on Saturdays, I have the great joy of getting to see my daughters play soccer. And as a commissioner, I should be able to look at every single one of those little girls on a soccer field and know exactly how the state is funding their education. Every parent deserves that. Every school should have that line of sight, and every district should know where their funding should go to best meet the needs of the students that they serve. That is a basic expectation that we need to have with a $9 billion investment in public school systems. And what I'm so grateful for in the feedback that we've received from the subcommittee, the support that we've received from our elected officials, is that ultimately this is about kids and only about kids. And it is ensuring that every kid, no matter where you live in the state, has the opportunity to thrive because they are funded for their individual needs. And so that's what we are hoping to do in this formula. That is what the formula is designed to accomplish. And I'm very grateful for where we are at this point. With that, I'll turn it back over to you,
Thank you,
sir.
Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
It is an important day for our state, and we believe that we have put together a formula, and I say we, that would be the thousands of people between the public comment, the subcommittees, the input from stakeholders across the state, the thousands of people that have put together this plan that funds our public education in a substantively important way. And we are encouraged about what has come together and where we are in this process. We do believe it's an important day for students and families in the future of Tennessee. Our public schools are the future of our state, and we need to appropriately invest in them. And we believe we're doing so with this investment in student achievement. So thanks for joining us. There'll be a lot more information and questions over the weeks ahead, but we're happy to get it rolled out and happy to take your questions. When we start here.
I want to get a little more information on what it looks like when districts are. Is it tied to students or is it the district's overall scores?
Sure. So everything is based on the individual student. So let's take a student in high school who earns a tier 2 or tier 3 industry credential. That child would receive an outcomes bonus that the district would be able to use. If that child is low income, it is a significantly higher level of bonus to account for that difference. And so that is an individual student bonus that is generated in the funding, and that would go to the district for local discretion on how it's spent.
So there would be like a small amount that would go for an individual student.
It is generated by the student, but it is for use at the district level.
But what about the critics who say that tying extra funding to performance might not be fair to some?
I think one of the things that we took into account is that there is significantly more outcomes funding for those students who are economically disadvantaged. So you might think, as an example, a student who earns a tier 2 credential generates an additional $1,000. A student who's economically disadvantaged might generate an additional $2,000 because it accounts for some of the additional challenges that might be in place for a student who has additional needs. One of the things, though, is the formula is designed to provide more funding to create that fairness between students and student groups. That's why there's so much more weighting for students with disabilities, characteristics of dyslexia, students who might be economically disadvantaged or in sparse communities.
About the schools that continually underperform. What happens to them? Are they going to face penalties?
No, so there is not a scenario that is considered in this bill that would reduce funding for schools. I think the idea is that when we are more specifically targeting resources to those students who need them, and we are appropriately being transparent, accurate reporting, and holding districts and schools accountable for how that money is spent to benefit those students who need it the most, that should generate better outcomes. That constant review cycle that happens on an annual basis, both in our reporting as well as the role that the General Assembly can take should they so choose, allows for that constant improvement cycle.
But maybe talk a bit more about, there does seem to be not incentive, but some schools look and be like, hey, like let's check these boxes on needs, or trying to figure out how much money can we actually get per student. What kind of guardrails, or do you anticipate that being an issue at all?
So first and foremost, we have significant auditing and monitoring procedures for that. That is from the Department of Education, the Comptroller's Office, as well as the federal government. all have different auditing and monitoring. We fund all of those groups with additional funding through the BEP. This is just very targeted to the needs of individual students. That being said, I deeply believe that our districts will operate with integrity. I talked to all 147 of our superintendents. What I want to make sure is that they understand how the formula works. They understand what that auditing and monitoring process looks like, and they have the appropriate professional development to ensure that they are getting the services and supports to the students who need them and deserve them, on top of all the monitoring and certainly auditing that will happen with that. Yep.
For all these rates that you guys have listed here, they all apply to the public.
That's any public school student. So yes, those at public charter schools as well. Sure. So unique learning needs is going to be defined through rulemaking. Currently, that is how it works in the BEP. For each of those 10 levels of unique learning needs, that is similar to the 10 levels we currently have in the BEP that are considered, they're called SPED option codes. What we heard from the subcommittees is twofold. So number one is for English learners, we need to differentiate the level of funding and support based on the need of English language proficiency. So those students who are just learning English, maybe first time in formal or public school, they would generate more funding because they need more services than those students who have mastered the English language. That's in the unique learning needs. Characteristics of dyslexia is new. That is also something that is very unique to Tennessee. And for those specific disability option codes, as we see in the BEP, we're going to have that crosswalk to help districts know if I was an option code 3, this is what that means for unique learning needs. All of that will be through rulemaking so that it will start with the department, but certainly be reviewed, approved by the GovOps committee.
Is there a state average? Is there an average?
No, and we're trying to stay away from averages because it's at the unique student need. We want to be able to say this is how much more money went to special education, for example, or this is the increase that happened with English learners. Because of our district's diversity, our districts look very different from one another. So you might have a district that sees that much higher % increase because they have a significant increase in the number of students who generate more weighted funding. So what I think would be the most fair apples to apples comparison is this is how much more funding is going towards economically disadvantaged students or students with disabilities. And we've seen increases across the board for those high need areas.
Bill, do you expect to sort of pass this session, and are you concerned about trying to do that? What if they say an 8-week period?
Yeah, you know, the bill will be in committee within a couple weeks. It's already being, presented, and the details of that to legislators at this point. So there's a lot of work that's beginning and a lot of conversation that's happening about it right now. There's a lot of work to be done, but there are weeks ahead and multiple committees ahead in the process. We certainly are very hopeful that this can get accomplished in this session. Certainly time, 30 years is a long time for a formula to be in place. It's overdue to replace it. There's been a tremendous amount of work. This has not just been done in a few weeks. It's been done over several months. So we're very hopeful.
Legislative Education Finance Committee that lawmakers in charge of individual schools because there might be capital for.
So the Ad Hoc Education Finance Committee has 3 actions that they can take, and it is at their discretion. No action. The second is a review or a corrective action plan. That is currently something that the department can apply to things as well. This is essentially a template that would be created by the department, go through rulemaking, and the General Assembly Ad Hoc Committee would be able to assign that corrective action template to a school district or a public charter school. The third is the same that what the General Assembly can do now, which is to have an inspector general appointed at the county level if there are issues concerning financial management in conjunction with academic performance. There are similar types of conditions that are put into place in other states. Part of that is to make sure there's an escalation process related to financial management. A few years ago, and this was certainly before my time, that has already happened in Tennessee, where because of federal government intervention, the department was required to put certain conditions on school districts. This is not anything that is new. It is essentially codifying existing processes.
Funding, I know you're getting an extra $1 billion, but do you think that would be enough? You know, $1 billion is already earmarked for certain things, you think it would be enough?
I'll make one comment. I'll let you add. What it's earmarked for is students. It's an investment in students. Those dollars will go directly to school districts based on the individual needs of those students. We think that's important. It's also historic investment, significantly more than what's been invested previously for public education. That combination of a historic investment and an earmark is not the right word, because you earmark for some unique one-off circumstance. This funding is entirely being invested in students in Tennessee for public school use. So we are hopeful that as this moves forward, districts, parents, students will see that this historic investment's been wisely spent.
This is your plan. Will you take responsibility if this form does not work?
We certainly believe that the strategy has been well thought out. There are a lot of folks who have put together. This is not my plan, although I'm happy to be responsible for it. This is a plan that was put together by hundreds of folks, if not thousands, including public comment. This is a plan that's been constructed by the people of Tennessee, and we feel confident in it. Yes, sir. I think this is going to work.
Can you explain that a little bit about how that could?
Yeah, so the comment about principals is right now we have about 265 schools in the state where we do not fully fund a principal at every building. The BEP does not generate enough money because it's based on ratios and averages, where we have actual schools that are not funded for a full-time principal. We've considered that in the new formula in terms of the base amount. And so this is saying that now every school can be funded to have a full-time principal, which is really important for that instructional leadership in the school day, which is going to support our students. Every school district sets their own salary schedule for principals, teachers, and other staff.
I also had an additional question regarding charter. Estimate how much money will charter schools receive?
Charter schools, public charter schools receive the same funding as any other public school student. The charter school facility fund that is currently outside of the BEP is brought into the TISA, so that there is no difference in that space. It would depend on the student who's attending. They generate the same in the formula the same way as any other public school student.